Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Decarbonizing Electricity, the Critical Role of Firm Low-Carbon Resources. This webinar is being presented by the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, and it's being hosted also by the Clean Energy States Alliance. And we have with us our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. He's the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. And we also have Jesse Jenkins, who's a professor at Princeton University. But before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes, and then we'll get back to our main presentation. So all of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can connect using a computer, mic, and speakers, or you can use your telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there, and you can also click on that to expand the webinar console if you'd like to see all of it. And one thing that you should know how to do on the webinar console is submit questions. You can do that by typing your questions into the questions box and hitting send. We will save some time at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we want to get to as many questions as we can. We do have a lot of people who registered for this webinar today, so we do expect to get a lot of questions. Make sure that we get to your questions. Submit your questions early when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording within about 48 hours. And we'll also post those materials on our website at cisa.org/webinars. And that's a good web address to know because that's also where we post information about our other upcoming webinars and where we archive all of our past webinar materials. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Warren Leon. As I said, Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will get us started today.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me first tell everybody a little bit about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national membership organization composed of public entities in 19 states. Most of our members are state energy agencies. And you can see our membership here on the screen. We do a lot of information sharing among our members. We identify best practices. We produce public programs like webinars and produce publications. We do a lot of group projects among our members. And our newest project, which is not strictly for our members, is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. And if we can go to the next slide. And that's what this webinar today is coming from, is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. That's a new initiative that CISA has launched to work with the 14 states plus the District of Columbia, which are entities that have embraced 100% clean energy goals for their electricity sector. We're going to help those states share information, cooperate so that they have an easier and smoother route towards achieving their goals. And as part of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative, we're going to have a regular newsletter with information about what's going on around the country related to state clean energy goals. We're going to have regular webinars. And one of the types of webinars we're going to have is a webinar where we get leading experts and analysts to give their perspective on deep decarbonization and 100% clean energy and present their point of view so that the states and all the rest of you on the call can learn from folks who have been doing a lot of interesting and creative thinking about this topic. And today's webinar is going to be presented by Jesse Jenkins, and let me tell you a little bit about him. Jesse Jenkins is an assistant professor at Princeton University, and he has a joint appointment there in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and with the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. He's also an affiliated faculty member at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and an associate faculty member at the Princeton Environmental Institute. Jesse is a macro-scale energy systems engineer with a focus on the rapidly evolving electricity sector, including the transition to zero carbon resources, the proliferation of distributed energy resources, and the role of electricity in economy-wide decarbonization. He's written widely and interestingly on those topics, and I, for one, am looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. So, Jesse, it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Warren and Samantha and the Clean Energy States Alliance. I am delighted to be here, and in particular to speak to this audience, which includes, a number of your members and folks from states across the country that are now working hard to transition towards a 100% clean or carbon-free electricity system. I just, before I jump into the findings, I want to just reflect back on the last few years. I began studying in detail as an academic researcher the transition to a deeply decarbonized or low carbon electricity system around 6 years ago, in about 2014. And at that time, I think that the most aggressive state statute on the books was probably the 50% RPS in California, perhaps a couple other states in similar ballpark. And most of the overall economy-wide emissions goals were on the order of an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions across the state economies for those states that were most aggressive in the country at tackling climate change. And that was the kind of federal target that the Obama administration at that time was discussing. And in my research, I thought it would be useful to start to think ahead towards what it might look like to get all the way to zero emissions in the electricity sector, to take that goal all the way up to 100% clean energy and zero carbon. And at that time, I was worried it was something of an academic topic that might not have enough relevance. We published a paper, my colleagues and I, on the value of energy storage in low carbon context, and it came out in 2016, and we began working on it back in 2014. And in that study, we purposely didn't go all the way to 100%. We thought it would be laughed at as too optimistic and too out of touch with where current discussions were at, and so we stopped short. And shortly thereafter began a follow-up study where we looked all the way at 100% decarbonized energy systems. That paper, which I'll discuss some of the findings of later today, was published in October 2018, shortly after California enacted their SB 100 law targeting 100% carbon-free electricity in California by 2045, one of now several states that have enacted statutes and executive orders making this what I thought might be a very academic topic, a very concrete and real policy objective and a tangible challenge for state decision makers and stakeholders across the country. Now that these laws are on the books, how do we get there cost effectively and decarbonize our electricity system to build a affordable, reliable, and 100% carbon-free energy supply? So I'm excited to share some of our research on that topic, to pull together a variety of threads of different papers, and try to focus in particular on the critical role of what I call firm low-carbon resources, technologies that are available any time of the year for as long as the system needs them, and provide a critical complement to weather-dependent variable renewable resources like wind and solar, and to more energy-constrained or short-duration resources like batteries and demand flexibility. And I'll talk about the role of each of those technologies in a moment, and try to make the case that we really need to focus more on complementing wind, solar, batteries, and demand flexibility, which are playing a substantial role in the system and are growing rapidly today, and complement those to complete our portfolio of low carbon resources with one or more of these firm low carbon technologies, which I'll talk about in this presentation. So to start, let's just look at the overall scale of the challenge for the electricity sector. This graphic is based on results from a forthcoming study that I've been a co-PI leader at Princeton, called the Net Zero America Study, which is looking at net zero emissions pathways for the whole country across the whole economy. And what we find, which is consistent with a number of other studies, is that clean electricity is the linchpin in any strategy to decarbonize the overall economy. Across the scenarios that we run, we see substantial increases in electricity demand, on the order of 150% growth in electricity consumption by 2050. as we decarbonize, as we electrify and help decarbonize transportation, heating, and other industrial processes that are reliant on fossil fuels today. At the same time that we have to drive emissions in the electricity sector rapidly towards zero. So this dual challenge of dramatically expanding electricity supplies while rapidly decarbonizing is the central challenge for the electricity sector and a linchpin in the overall economy-wide strategy. So what this graphic here shows is a couple of different scenarios with different levels of end-use electrification assumptions, the E+ and E- cases, and the total electricity demand over between now and 2050 in our modeled scenarios. And then I have the existing portfolio of resources in the bars below that. So in 2020, we have our existing mix, which is approximately 60% fossil powered from coal and natural gas. And then about 40% carbon free, with about half of that from nuclear and the other half from a combination of renewable sources, including existing large-scale hydro plants, wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal. If we assume that we rapidly phase out coal and ramp down our reliance on existing natural gas plants over time as consistent with our modeling, you can see the role that the existing fleet plays going forward in our model results. And here we assume about half of the existing nuclear power plants continue operating to an 80-year life and therefore are still contributing to a portion of the low carbon portfolio in 2050, and that all of the existing wind, solar, and hydro is maintained. So if we take the gap then between the line here, which is the total electricity demand in each of these scenarios in each year, and the remaining contribution from the existing generation sources, what we get is the new amount of total carbon-free electricity generation that has to be added to the US grid over time. So to give this some context, here is an overlay that shows the total total 2020 generation today from all carbon-free electricity sources. So all the hydro, wind, solar, nuclear, et cetera, across the country. And on this trajectory to be on track to a net zero economy-wide goal by 2050, we essentially have to build double all of the existing low carbon generation or zero carbon generation in the country sometime before 2030. So within the next 6 to 7 years, we need to be adding the equivalent of all existing low carbon generation to the grid in the form of new carbon-free electricity sources. Then sometime between 2037 and 2040, we have to basically double the entirety of the current US electricity grid worth of electricity generation, all from new carbon-free sources. And depending on the pace of electrification, basically do that all again by 2050. Clearly, this is a daunting challenge. If we think about the scale and pace of deployment, it is quite unprecedented, and it is why focus today on the right policy and planning and market environments needed to induce this level of deployment is critical that we focus on that now rather than delay any further. If we think about the annual addition rate of new low carbon generation, and we adjust for the different capacity factors or utilization rates of different technologies, such that we take the total capacity and divide by the capacity factor, we end up with an average gigawatt of production. So this is the equivalent of a steady state output at 1 gigawatt of production, which is, for context, about enough electricity to supply on the order of 850,000 average American households for their entire year. So a pretty good sized city worth of homes. Or the average output on a steady state basis of a large nuclear power plant, a single large nuclear reactor. So if we take the average rate of growth between now and 2050, essentially what we need to be doing is bringing online between 35 and 37 average gigawatts worth of new low carbon capacity between now and 2050 every year. And for context, we can look at how we've been doing over the last several years. So the average rate of deployment for wind and solar or non-hydro renewables in the US between 2010 and 2018, after adjusting for capacity factor, amounts to 3.4 average gigawatts per year of sustained growth. And our peak year, which was 2016, we added 5.3 average gigawatts of combined non-hydro renewables, mostly wind at that point. I think before COVID-19 hit the country, the EIA was projecting that 2020 would be a record year, which would exceed 2016 by a little bit. We'll see how that shakes out at the end of the year, but that's sort of the pace that we've been on historically. And in essence, we need to be going about 7 times faster than the maximum annual rate of additions of wind and solar in 2016, or the projected amount that we were going to have brought online in 2020. If we look at other low carbon sources and we adjust across time for changes in US population to try to normalize these comparisons, and we look at the sustained rate of US nuclear expansion, the fastest decade of expansion was 1981 to 1990, when the US brought online the average of an average of 7.4 average gigawatts per year. So we still need to be going about 5 times faster than the population adjusted sustained rate of growth of US nuclear power plants in the 1980s to 1990. So this is a really substantial acceleration in the rate of clean energy additions. If we look elsewhere for precedent, we can see that Germany, on a population adjusted basis, has been growing at about double the rate that we have in the United States for new renewables. So their average rate from 2009 to 2018 was 6 average gigawatts, and the maximum year was 12 average gigawatts. And if we look at the fastest rate of capacity additions in any individual technology in the US, it was the US boom in natural gas-fired power plants in the 2000s after many states restructured their electricity markets, when we brought online the sustained average of 23 average gigawatts of new gas-fired capacity per year. I think the peak in non-capacity factor adjusted terms was about 50 gigawatts in a single year, which is starting to get closer to the ballpark that we need to see to make the transition to net zero. Elsewhere, we can look at France and Sweden, which have the fastest sustained annual growth rates of low carbon resources that we can find in the records. And in the late 1970s and 1980s, they brought online the equivalent in population adjusted terms of 26 to 30 average gigawatts. So that's starting to get close to the rates that we need to see. Clearly, this is a challenge that requires focused policy and effective market environments that can sustain the kind of scale of investment in clean energy resources that we need to be on track to these sorts of ambitious climate and clean energy goals. And there's really nothing that we've seen in the past that quite matches that pace of growth. So we need a step change acceleration in our transition towards clean energy sources, or we'll fall increasingly behind these carbon-free goals. Now for some good news, which I think many of you know, the cost of wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries has plummeted over the last decade. And that is, I think, largely to thank for the kind of ambitious goals that we now are comfortable setting in our electricity sector, contemplating 100% renewable or 100% carbon-free or clean electricity systems. So just in the last decade, really from 2009 to 2018 to be precise, since this is starting to get dated by a couple of years, we've seen basically a 90% drop in the cost per megawatt hour of solar, 70% drop in the cost per megawatt hour of wind, and a nearly 90% drop in the cost of lithium-ion battery packs per kilowatt hour of storage capacity. And that is just a remarkable shift from where we were just a few years ago, when these technologies cost substantially more than other available electricity sources. If you follow these energy discussions, like most of you I assume do, you've, I'm sure, seen these comparisons that note now that wind and solar have now fallen in cost substantially, such that they are lower than the cost of new gas or certainly coal-fired power plant construction on a levelized cost basis, and are increasingly zeroing in on the cost, the levelized cost of continuing to run existing coal-fired power plants in the United States. And I used to think this was sort of the tipping point at which we would see solar and wind take off without sustained additional policy support and effectively take over the system. I mean, if solar and wind are cheaper than gas or coal or nuclear, then shouldn't they scale to take off and take over the whole market? And thanks to the early public policy support that many of the states in the Clean Energy States Alliance and the federal government, countries like Germany and Spain and elsewhere, have devoted to scale up solar and wind when they were more costly than alternatives, we drove experience curves and learning by doing, which drove down the cost of these technologies as cumulative capacity here shown in the dotted lines increased. We've now reached that crossover point. Unfortunately, this is an incomplete comparison, as I'll explain in a moment, and it leads to an interesting riddle, which was recently posed by David Olson, one of the members of the CAISO Board of Governors, who commented in a recent article in Utility Dive that counterintuitively, it can be more expensive to add cheap solar to the grid than to add expensive geothermal, which is maybe should be thought of as sort of an ancient koan or riddle. It's quite an interesting statement, and one that I'd like to unpack a bit further to help us explain why it can often be better or cheaper to add a more expensive resource to the system on a levelized cost basis than to add a cheaper resource like solar or wind. And the reason I like to say an analogy is that comparing the cost of wind or solar power to the cost of a nuclear plant or the cost of a coal or natural gas plant is a little bit like comparing the cost of a banana to the cost of a burger when you're trying to decide what to eat. Cost is a relevant piece of information. It's good to know that the banana is less than the burger, costs less than the burger. But that's clearly not all of the information you need when you're trying to decide what to eat. If you ate only burgers, I think your doctor would yell at you. And if you ate only bananas, they probably would too. We need a balanced diet, of course, that consists of a variety of different foods and nutrients. And in fact, the more of a particular nutrient we get, say the potassium in a banana or the protein in a burger, the less valuable it is to continue to consume that type of nutrient. And so the relative value of these of different foods depends on everything else you're eating and the magnitude or degree at which you're consuming different nutrients. And so they each have sort of a diminishing value in your diet. Much is the same with the electricity system, where we have a variety of different technologies, each of which plays slightly different roles in our overall electricity diet or our clean energy portfolio. And therefore, while cost is a relevant comparison, just like comparing the cost of the banana to the burger is not enough to decide what to eat, comparing the levelized cost of wind or solar to other technologies or gas to nuclear is insufficient to identify the least cost mix of resources that we might want to have to reach our carbon-free goals. As a further explanation of this, let's take a simplified model of the ISO New England system. So we're going to use demand and wind and solar profiles from New England, where I lived for many years working on my PhD. And we'll just take 4 different technologies here. We'll assume we have wind and solar, which are quite cheap based on recent costs. And we'll assume that we have natural gas, which can act as a fossil-fired firm resource when we need it, when the wind and solar are unavailable. And we'll also assume in later examples that we have a clean, firm technologies. Maybe it's new nuclear power or maybe it's geothermal that costs substantially more than either existing gas or than the other low carbon alternatives, wind or solar, on a levelized cost basis. So here we assume that the clean, firm technology costs 7 cents a kilowatt hour, or basically twice the cost of the solar or wind. And let's take this simple model. This is not the model I use in my research. It's a simple spreadsheet model we can use to kind of unpack some of these dynamics. So it doesn't include things like energy storage or demand flexibility or any of the ramping constraints on thermal power plants. But let's just take a snapshot of every hour of the year. And we'll require the model to increase the share of clean energy, much like a renewable portfolio standard or clean electricity standard would require in each of these states. And so in the initial example, we'll set that clean energy share requirement to 20%. And so the model will pick enough solar or wind to meet 20% of annual electricity demand, accounting for curtailments. And we'll assume that gas generation fills in the remainder in each of the hours when solar or wind fall short of meeting all of our demand. So in this case, you can see the hourly demand profile for the ISO New England system across the year, with some cold snaps in the winter and then some higher peaks in the summer during hot, muggy periods when we're all using our air conditioning in the Northeast. I have a variety of dials up on top here which show the relative value of wind and solar as they increase their capacity. And before I note those, let's just say this kind of hourly profile is somewhat difficult to look at. So let's transform it into what we call a load duration curve, which just reorders each hour of the year from highest to lowest demand. So that instead of looking at them in chronological order, we look at it in order from the peak demand, which is 34 gigawatts on one of those hot summer days, all the way down to the lowest demand hour, which probably occurs overnight on the weekend and in the spring. And you can see now the shape of the demand curve. And then the green and yellow slice is the portion of that demand that is met by solar or wind. And I've just combined them together here in this now into one slice. And then you can see the brown is the remaining generation we get from gas. So the goal over the next few slides is we're going to try to increase that green and yellow slice and reduce the gas share. So first we have the dials up top here, and we have a couple different sources of value for wind and for solar. So first we see the energy value at the top, which starts out at 100%. And by 100% energy value, I mean that every megawatt hour that the next solar or wind farm added to the system generates will displace 1 megawatt hour of natural gas. So it has an energy saving value or fuel saving value equal to the operating cost and fuel cost of that natural gas. So that's what a 100% energy value means. Every megawatt hour of renewable energy displaces a megawatt hour of gas and the fuel and energy costs associated with that gas. Then we have the capacity value dials, which show for every 100 megawatts of wind or solar capacity, how much do I reduce the need for firm capacity in the net peak period? So the total peak demand minus the contribution from wind and solar, which in this example occurs on September 8th at 5 p.m. Which, because it's in the evening, solar has a very low capacity value. So it's only 4% even at this initial example, because on September 8th at 5 p.m., the sun is low in the sky and it might be a cloudy day. And so the capacity factor for solar is only 4%, which means that for every 100 megawatts of solar we add to the system, we can only displace or shut down 4 megawatts of natural gas capacity that we otherwise need to meet our firm demands. And for wind, this must be a relatively low wind speed, muggy, calm summer day, where we only have about 9% average wind capacity factor across the New England states. And so therefore, for every 100 megawatts of wind we add, we can only displace 9 megawatts of natural gas. The final dial over here to keep an eye on is the overgeneration dial. This is the portion of wind and solar that is generated in any given hour that exceeds the demand in that hour. We'll assume that we can ramp down natural gas plants flexibly all the way to 0, when in reality there's going to be some minimum output levels that will constrain things a bit more tightly in a real system. But let's just assume if we have wind and solar and the total generation from these sources is less than demand, we'll consume all of it. And if it exceeds demand in that hour, then that constitutes overgeneration, which is output that either needs to be wasted and therefore has no value, or needs to be shifted through energy storage, which has an added cost. So now what happens when we go to 40% clean energy share? Well, now the first interesting thing happens, which is that initially the model only selected solar capacity to meet the 20% share, because as you remember from the beginning setup, solar has a lower levelized cost than wind. But now the model, now that it tries to go up to 40% energy share from clean sources, picks a mix of both wind and solar, even though wind is more expensive than solar. So about 5% of the share comes or 10% comes from wind and 30% comes from solar. And the reason for that is that we're now starting to see overgeneration. We have time periods here in the blue when the total available wind and solar exceeds the demand. And that means that in these hours, we've fully displaced the natural gas power plants. And so the fuel saving value of an additional megawatt hour of wind and solar in those periods falls to 0. Basically, you have solar displacing solar or solar displacing wind on the margin in those periods of time. And since wind and solar have no fuel costs, the energy value falls towards 0. So what we've seen now is that because of the different temporal profiles at which solar and wind generate, they have a different decline in energy value. Solar output, of course, is very concentrated in certain periods during the middle of the day and during sunny periods, whereas the wind variability is a bit more spread out across time and across seasons. And therefore, the solar energy value falls rapidly. So at this share, it's fallen 77%, whereas for wind, it's only fallen 91%. And that means that in essence, for the next wind and solar or wind facility that we add, 91% of its generation will displace gas and 9% will occur during periods when we already have overgeneration. And for solar, that means 77% of the generation from the next megawatt we deploy will displace natural gas, and 23% will occur during this concentrated period when we already have overgeneration. And so because they have differing, the energy value of solar and wind fall at a different pace, the model is trying to keep their energy value, their value and their cost effectively to be equal. And so as solar energy value falls, it makes wind relatively more valuable, even though it has a higher cost, and the model wants to start deploying additional wind capacity as well. So here we already have the first example of the model picking a more expensive technology in an effort to lower the total system cost, because that more expensive technology also delivers greater value to our overall energy diet or portfolio. When we go to 60% share, the role for wind actually expands even more. And that's because, again, it doesn't decline in its energy value quite so quickly as solar, which has now fallen to 59% of the original value, whereas wind has only fallen to 72%. We're now over-generating in that blue wedge there enough generation to meet 7% of annual electricity demand if we were able to capture and move that to another period of time. And something else interesting happens, which is that we see the net peak, or the time when we need the most firm generation, so the total demand minus available wind and solar, shift from that September day to August 19th at 6 p.m. And because it's now even later in the day, the solar capacity value falls further to 2%. And apparently this is one of those moments when it's simply calm across the whole of the region, and the average wind capacity value is down to only 2% as well. When we go to 80%, we can see that how non-linearly this challenge increases. So that initially we had very small increments of increase in overgeneration and declines in capacity value here in the first couple examples. And as we go to 80%, we can see the huge increase in the amount of overgeneration. And this is simply because we're trying to displace this natural gas consumption, the brown triangle over here, which occurs at exactly the times when wind and solar capacity values are relatively low. And so as we add more capacity to the system to try to knock out gas on this edge, we're also adding a lot of additional generation in the time periods when wind and solar capacity factors are high. So all of that is clustered in this triangle over here in the green or the blue overgeneration wedge. So we sort of have twin sides of the variability coin here for wind and solar, because we get such little generation during the times when we really want to displace gas. We have to add a lot of capacity, and that means on the other side, when wind and solar are generating a lot, we get a huge amount of overgeneration that rises non-linearly as we try to drive up the share of wind and solar. And now the solar energy value has fallen to 1/5 of its original value, and the wind energy value has fallen to 1/4 of its original value. Now, so far, I wasn't allowing the model to pick the clean, firm source. We assumed it's too expensive. It costs more than double the cost of solar and wind. So let's just prohibit its development initially. Now, if we relax that constraint and we let the model pick between cheap wind and solar and the apparently more expensive clean firm technology, we actually see that the model picks quite a bit of it. And that's because firm technologies don't face the same kind of variability as wind and solar. We can choose when to dispatch their generation. And therefore, they have a very high capacity value at basically 1-for-1 substitution of firm capacity from clean sources for gas. And therefore, whereas the capacity value of wind and solar is only a couple percent, for the clean firm technology, it's 100%. And at the same time, it has a higher energy value because the bulk of the generation from the firm source can be dispatched in the periods when natural gas is consuming. Here, I assume that as a nuclear plant, for example, can only ramp down to a portion of its output, that we had to keep it running at half of its output in these periods. So that's why it doesn't go all the way to 0. Depends on the technology you select, how flexible it is. But here we can see that most of the generation, probably 80% of it, occurs in periods when we don't have overgeneration, and therefore when the energy value is high. So I didn't put the dials on here for the firm resource, but its energy value would essentially be about 80% and its capacity value about 100%. In contrast to solar and wind with very low, near 0 capacity values and energy values in the 30 to 40% range. So if you have a technology that costs twice as much, but is worth twice as much or more in the energy system, that the best thing to do to lower the overall cost of the system is to add a mix of technologies, including the apparently more expensive technology on a levelized cost basis. We take a step back from this simple example. We think about the range of options that we have available to us. We can think about what essentially ends up being 3 different categories of technologies, or 3 pieces of our overall energy diet that we need to make sure that we fill. This is an attempt to replace the kind of conventional baseload, intermediate fuel saving, baseload load following and peaking kind of framework that we often use to think about classifying thermal power plants based on their techno-economic characteristics and their ability to meet different slices of the load duration curve throughout the year. In a variable renewable context, that is not really the relevant distinguishing factors. And in fact, a baseload plant that can't ramp down may be less valuable, for example, and we need a different taxonomy, different mix of resources to fill the low carbon electricity needs. So in our 2016 paper on the role of firm low carbon resources, 2018 paper, we introduced this new taxonomy, which groups the three different classes of resources into 3 categories. The first are fuel saving variable renewables. So here's where wind and solar PV, as well as run-of-river hydro plants fit in. And these are technologies that we classify primarily as fuel savers because, as you saw in the last example, at high penetration levels, solar and wind and run-of-river hydro don't generate a lot of energy during the periods when you need the most firm capacity. So they have very little capacity value, but they do have a large amount of fuel-saving energy substitution value. And so we think of them primarily in this role as fuel-saving resources. Then we have what we call fast burst or balancing resources, which is where battery storage from lithium-ion batteries, for example, flexible demand rescheduling and price responsive demand curtailment or demand response all play a role. These are technologies that deliver a lot of capacity value, a lot of flexibility, but can't sustain their output for long periods of time. So they're either energy constrained, as in the case of batteries, or you're not going to delay your EV charging for weeks. You might only delay it for a few hours overnight. And you're not going to sustain demand curtailment for a long period of time, perhaps only for a few hours when electricity prices are the highest. So these technologies are good complements within the day to sort of manage the intra-daily or hourly variability of the fuel-saving variable renewable resources and to provide flexibility and capacity value on short timeframes. Then the third category are the firm low-carbon resources, which are, as I mentioned, technologies that are not weather dependent and not energy constrained, and therefore can meet our energy demands any time of the year or season for as long as needed by the system operators or the market. And this includes technologies like geothermal, biomass, and zero carbon fuels that could include hydrogen or ammonia produced from renewable sources or natural gas with carbon capture, as well as non-renewable sources like gas or coal plants with carbon capture and sequestration or nuclear power. And of course, we use natural gas and coal plants for this firm role today in our power system, but they're not low carbon options in a 100% carbon-free or clean energy system. So what we need is then to think about the relative role of all three of these resources. Here I show them as equal sized triangles, but in reality, their relative balance is going to change depending on the system and the weather context and the relative cost of these technologies. So if we're going to see each of these play a big role, what we have to see is two things. One, a continued race between the declining cost and the declining value of wind, solar, and batteries. So these technologies are going to play a huge role. They're cheap, they're getting cheaper still, and they're going to play a substantial role in decarbonizing our electricity system, especially over the next decade, and continue to be on that as well. But the ultimate role of wind and solar and batteries will depend on whether their declining cost exceeds their decline in value as we deploy more and more of them in the system. So this is an example here of the declining value of solar PV, which encompasses all the kind of declining energy and capacity value dynamics that I showed you in the simple example earlier, drawn from 3 different studies of 3 different geographic contexts, one of Germany, one of California, and one of Texas, which shows the average market value or system value of solar of each megawatt hour that a solar farm or solar PV plant generates on the y-axis here, and how that changes as the market share of solar PV increases in the system. And you can see that whereas different systems are different, so they have different mixes and different values, they all have a consistent downward trend, such that as we deploy more and more energy share from our market share from solar PV, the value drops steadily. And that means that whereas initially the value exceeds the kind of recent costs for solar PV, eventually that value will fall below the current costs. And so the question is whether costs will continue to decline faster than value, making these sources economic to continue to deploy at scale, or whether value will decline faster than cost, in which case these technologies, solar and wind, will require additional subsidies out of market in order to continue to see their increased deployment. Again, there are several factors that I summarized in the previous kind of example of the key mechanisms driving this value decline. One is a decline in the fuel saving value or energy substitution. So as we deploy more and more wind and solar, we saw that more and more of that output is concentrated in periods when we've already shut down all of the coal and gas plants that we can. And the additional generation from wind and solar in those periods only displaces other low marginal cost resources like wind, solar, nuclear, or hydro. The second is the decrease in the capacity value. So initially, solar might help us reduce our peak consumption by some amount, but over time, solar and wind output basically shifts the net peak period, or the time when we need the most firm capacity, to times when wind and solar output are low. And therefore, we end up with a decrease in the capacity substitution value. And we get an increase in overgeneration, or energy that must either be stored at some cost or wasted with no value, when supply exceeds its demand. I want to note that these value decline factors in our research are found to be much more substantial than the so-called integration costs that are often estimated, which reflect more direct costs imposed on thermal power plants or transmission networks due to the increased penetration of variable renewables. So that's things like the need for increased flexibility or ramping and reserve requirements, the cost of cycling thermal power plants more often, or the need to expand transmission. These are real costs as well and do contribute to the overall system equation. But as many studies have found, these are relatively modest costs on the order of a few dollars per megawatt hour in most cases. Whereas, as we saw previously, the decline in fuel saving and capacity substitution value can be on the order of magnitude, or an 80 or 90% decline in these values as we reach high shares of wind and solar. So these are really the governing factors, the decline in value rather than the increase in integration costs. There are similar dynamics for storage. This is from a 2016 paper I published on the value of energy storage, which shows that as we increase the power capacity here, so rather than energy, we think of storage as a capacity resource. So as we increase the capacity of storage as a percentage of peak demand, we also see a steady decline in the relative value of energy storage per kilowatt hour of storage capacity installed. And so to reach 20 to 30% of peak demand, which is sort of the scale at which we have open cycle gas turbines or simple cycle gas turbine deployment in the US today, we would need to see solar or lithium ion costs continue to fall on the order of 65 to 75% below 2018 costs. Again, that's not impossible. Solar and wind and storage costs are expected to continue to fall. The question is how rapidly will cost decline relative to value? Then there are several mechanisms that drive this decline as well. One is that there are sort of niche markets for storage, like providing frequency regulation or reserves, which have high value but are relatively small markets, and so those fill up quickly. The second is a need for increasing energy storage duration or capacity in order to maintain the capacity substitution value. So if you want to displace the first open cycle peaker plant that might only run a few hours of the year, for example, you might only need to have a couple 2 to 4 hours of storage duration to replace that infrequently used gas plant. But as you start to eat down into the gas capacity further and further, you'll find power plants that run for longer periods of time and more frequently. And therefore, if storage is to displace their capacity, you need to have 8, 10, 12, 16 hours of storage duration in order to continue to displace the capacity from those technologies. The third is a decline in the energy arbitrage or buy-sell spread that storage earns much of its value from. So storage is effectively making money by buying electricity when it's cheap and selling it when it's expensive. And that difference is the value that helps pay for the cost of the solar. And then as in any arbitrage opportunity, the more people who buy low, the higher the low price gets. And the more people that sell high, the lower the high price gets. And so the more storage we have in the system, we get a compression of this buy-sell spread, and that reduces steadily the energy arbitrage value. And the final piece is a decline in the utilization rate. The first storage we might deploy might charge, it might cycle twice a day, charging overnight to meet the morning peak, and then during the day when solar output is high to meet the afternoon peak. But as we add more and more storage to the system, the incremental storage capacity is utilized less frequently, and that means you have less cycles to pay back your capital and a corresponding decline in value. So to sum this up, the picture for wind, solar, and batteries, I think, is still bright. They are continuing to fall in cost, and in the near term, we can still see a substantial runway for wind, solar, and batteries, as well as in some regions, a coal to gas transition in regions that haven't completed that yet. Can drive rapid emissions reductions in each of our states. And that's going to account for the vast majority of the emissions declines over the next decade timeframe. In the longer term, though, to fully decarbonize electricity, we need firm low carbon substitutes for both natural gas plants, which are increasingly playing this role as complement to wind and solar, and any nuclear power plants that retire due to age or local opposition over the same time period that we're trying to decarbonize. In a 2018 paper published in the journal Joule with colleagues from MIT, we explored this role of firm low carbon resources extensively, looking at thousands of different combinations of technology costs, high expensive firm resources and cheap wind and solar, vice versa, different levels of demand flexibility, and 2 different power systems, a northern system with demand and weather patterns similar to New England, and a southern system similar to Texas. What we found is that across all of those scenarios, Having one or more of these firm low carbon resources available lowered the cost of reaching zero emissions or 100% carbon-free electricity systems by anywhere between 10 and 62% relative to a case in which all we have are wind, solar, and battery technologies complemented by demand flexibility. And without these resources, the electricity costs rise rapidly as we try to reach our 100% goals or near zero emissions. So we can see that here in this graphic, which shows the range of results for the northern system. On the first panel, we have our case where we only have wind and solar as fuel-saving options and storage and demand flexibility as fast burst options. And we have to rely on natural gas for the firm role because we didn't provide any firm low carbon options to the model. And in the other case, we add a range of firm low carbon options, new nuclear power, natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration, solid biomass, and biogas. And what we find is that as we kind of get down to a 100 gram per kilowatt hour emissions rate, which is about an 80% reduction in emissions, the costs are really not different between these two scenarios. But as we go beyond that towards our 100% goals, the costs rise rapidly in the case where we lack firm substitutes for natural gas. And here you can see the sort of exponential increase in cost as we get closer and closer to zero emissions, as we try to use wind and solar and batteries for a role that they're not cut out for in the system. Pushing them outside of their key role as fuel-saving and fast burst technologies to try to substitute for firm capacity from natural gas. Instead, when we have one or more of these technologies available, and it really doesn't matter a whole lot which technology it is, we see costs fall dramatically. And we can see that in particular that the colored dots here represent our assumptions about the cost of wind, solar, and batteries. So the conservative case is about 2018 costs. And then we have two levels of cost declines from NREL's forecast, the mid-range and low-cost cases in yellow and green. You can see that and under any assumption for how cheap wind and solar or batteries get, it is substantially cheaper to have firm low-carbon resources, even across the range of assumptions we made about the cost of those technologies, which include cases where we assume that nuclear costs as much as Vogtle in Georgia, the vastly overrun, delayed power plant there, and in which natural gas with CCS is not available, and all the way down to optimistic assumptions where we can build low-cost small modular reactors or have lots of biogas available or similar zero-carbon fuels. So we can see that these are lower-cost cases, and the total spread in cost across technology scenarios is substantially reduced, meaning we're much less dependent on substantial breakthroughs in cost or performance in order to achieve our zero-carbon goals affordably. In short, having one or more firm low carbon resources translates this into a low cost and low risk, a much lower cost and lower risk transition to a zero carbon system, in which the kind of technological uncertainty we face today about which technologies might play this firm low carbon role in the 2030s or 2040s and how cheap wind and solar might get in the long term is much less consequential to the affordability of our transition to 100% carbon free. I know I'm running a little late on time, so let me just push through a couple more slides. I'm going to skip this. And I just want to emphasize that solar, wind, and batteries are going to be star players of our low carbon team. Here we have the star point guard from our Princeton women's team this year. But of course, if you try to field a basketball team consisting entirely of point guards or power forwards, rather than a team that consists of star players each playing their correct position on the court, you're going to get beat every time by a more balanced team. And that's exactly what's going on here. When we try to push wind, solar, and batteries, not just to be stars in an overall team, but to play roles on the court that they're not well suited to, we stumble and fall short of our goals. When we have a full team of low carbon resources, including one or more firm low carbon substitutes for natural gas and retiring nuclear, we can readily win the low carbon game. So these firm low carbon resources complete the team. And as I mentioned, there are several options, all of which are relatively immature or more costly than we would prefer today. And that means that even as we deploy more wind, solar, and batteries over the next decade, we also need to use the same kind of policies that were consequential in driving down the cost and improving the maturity of wind, solar, and batteries over the last decade, and apply those same tools to improving and completing our team of firm low carbon options over the coming decade. The options include small modular or other advanced nuclear reactors, carbon capture and storage plants. This is an example, the demonstration alum cycle oxy-fuel natural gas plant that Net Power has constructed along with Exelon and others in outside of Houston, Texas, that has been operating for the last year. We could also use zero carbon fuels. We could combust hydrogen at high blends or synthetic methane from renewable or low carbon sources in existing gas plants converted with new combustors or new build natural gas plants designed to burn high hydrogen shares. In regions that have access to hydropower with large reservoirs like Quebec or Sweden and Norway and Europe, these large reservoirs can also act as firm low carbon options. So for those in the Northeast that are considering connecting to Hydro-Quebec, for example, that may be a firm low carbon substitute available on a regional basis. Enhanced geothermal energy systems offer a way to expand the availability of geothermal resources across particularly the American West by using techniques similar to hydraulic fracturing for shale oil and gas to stimulate porous heat transfer opportunities within hot rocks drilled down to at depths across much of the West. And if we can unlock this technology cost effectively and incorporate the kind of learning and experience from the oil and gas sector to make this a cost effective technology, it could ultimately generate more electricity than our nuclear power fleet today and could contribute particularly substantially in the American West, but is at an early demonstration stage today and in need of additional policy support. Finally, what about energy storage? Some of us paying attention to news recently this week of Forum Energy's announcement of a very long duration, 150-hour energy storage demonstration that Great River Energy is going to deploy in North Dakota. And of course, we see a lot of deployment now, multi-hundred megawatt lithium-ion batteries that are coming onto the grid. So why don't we just use more storage to deal with the intermittency and variability of wind and solar? Well, I wanted to give you an example. This is a model outcome for the Western United States, the Western Interconnect System, that is a cost-optimized, region-wide zero carbon energy mix that includes only renewables and batteries along with a long-duration storage option here modeled as hydrogen storage in underground salt caverns. What you can see here is the average daily demand and the wind and solar output on a rolling 24-hour basis. And you can see that the demand in red varies around while the wind, solar, and hydro that's optimized across the whole Western interconnect varies as well. And that there are long periods of time that I've highlighted here, 5 days, 11 days, and as much as a couple of months in the summer, when the total wind and solar and hydro output falls short of the average demand on a daily basis. What that means is that the kind of energy storage that we would need to get through these options without a firm generation source is a very long duration storage capacity. Here we see this is the average state of charge of the hydrogen storage system as it meets these long-term periods. And you can see it's charges for several weeks at a time and then discharges over a sustained period of days or weeks or even months in these examples. And this is an enormous amount of storage. It's on the order of 33 terawatt hours, which if you think about that in terms of lithium-ion battery packs, it would be the equivalent of 2.4 billion Tesla Powerwalls, which is the home storage system that Tesla offers for you. So think about, scale that you could deploy in your garage. We would need on the order of 2.4 billion of those to have that scale of capacity. So my message on long duration storage is that this is a possible option, but what it's going to need is a very different kind of storage than the batteries that we're deploying today. As we show in our research, lithium-ion batteries play a role as a fast burst technology that is most useful for balancing the variability of wind and solar within a daily time frame. But if we want storage to displace the role for firm generation and enable a 100% renewable energy system, we need a very different type of storage entirely, one that is designed for much more infrequent utilization. In this example, we have only a couple of cycles for this capacity throughout the year. Some of it is even cycled once. And so it has to be very, very low cost per megawatt hour of storage capacity. And it needs to be able to sustain output for many days or weeks at a time. And this is where the sort of long duration electrochemical technologies that Forum Energy and others are working on, or the underground hydrogen storage options that others are considering in Utah and elsewhere, where we have salt caverns that could be made very large to store hydrogen or compressed air. Or potentially thermal storage options that could offer these very low costs. I have some forthcoming research out on this topic that we'll be happy to share in a few months. But to suffice it to say, this is a technology that has to be very different from the batteries we're used to and are seeing deployed at scale today. It has to cost on the order of a few dollars per kilowatt hour for storage capacity maybe in the low tens of dollars per kilowatt hour relative to lithium ion, which costs several $100s per kilowatt hour today. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully there's some time for a few questions. I can stick around a little bit past the hour as well if others can also, and happy to hear your questions now. Thanks for having me speak with you.
Hey, thanks very much for that thorough and very articulate presentation. Let's jump into questions, and we will plan to go to, say, 10 minutes after the hour.
Perfect.
Before we get into the large number of questions we got around the issue of firm resources, a couple clarifying questions in terms of just your forecast of energy demand. How does and the energy mix, how does your forecast compare to those from EIA and IEA? And then secondly, what are your assumptions about electrification in the transportation sector and in building electrification?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say we don't do forecasts in my group. Our goal is not to predict the future, it's to try to explore it. And because there's substantial uncertainty about what that future looks like, just look at how bad we've been at forecasting, in various agencies in the past. We think it's most helpful to explore a wide range of possible futures and try to use our models, not as crystal balls, but as, what ifs, to look out at a range of possible outcomes and to try to identify strategies or insights that are robust across all of those futures. And that's where I focus, our work, for example, on the broad role of firm low carbon resources, rather than say, for example, what we need is cheap nuclear power or what we need is enhanced geothermal energy. And the reason for that is that when we look at this wide range of possible scenarios where we assume, what if nuclear makes no progress from today? Or what if, we commercialize a cheap small modular reactor that is, $3,000 a kilowatt and changes the economics dramatically? What if carbon capture and sequestration never takes off? Or what if we see a substantial investment due to recent tax credits and that technology scales and becomes cheap? We can explore all of those possibilities and try to find solutions and insights that are robust. So what we did with the firm low carbon resources paper, for example, is used a whole range of cost combinations. We had 3 different values for wind, solar, and battery costs, 3 different assumptions, ranging from no improvement to substantial improvement in each of these cases for nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration, and 3 different assumptions about the availability of biogas or zero carbon, gas fuel. And then we did all of the combinations of those. So we had, all the combinatorics of all of those 3 different levels. And that's why we ended up with about 1,000 different cases in that paper, all spanning different possible futures with differing assumptions about technologies and their availability. And what we saw is that across that full range, one or more of those firm low carbon technologies is needed. And we don't know which one will win out in the end. But what we know is that as long as we have one of them, the costs fall dramatically. And so I think the core insight is more about the role of different technologies and the kind of pieces of the puzzle that we need to have, or the pieces of our low carbon diet that we have to fill. And it will remain to be seen which technologies fill that role in the portfolio or the diet, and that'll depend on how they progress over time. So we need to have some flexibility in our policies. We should, that's where goals that are focused on ends like 100% clean energy or carbon-free energy, rather than means like 20% solar or 50% renewables, are more flexible and might be better equipped to capture the kind of change of and uncertainty that we face. And we need to also be helping expand our options by using kind of proactive policies for early stage technologies to see which might mature and become cost effective. And those are the kinds of the robust insights that you can see across these sorts of broad range of scenarios.
Great. And I had a couple technology specific questions that came in. One asked about offshore wind. The assumption is that offshore wind could end up with capacity factors of 55% or more in certain locations. Does that change your analysis at all if you end up with a capacity factor that high for a wind technology?
Yeah, it doesn't change it dramatically. I mean, it's incrementally better. It also is much more costly. So you have to balance the increase in capacity factor and the change in the temporal profile with the increased cost of offshore wind. we see onshore sites in much of the country that are already getting into that range of 45, 50, 55% capacity factor as well, due to improvements in turbine technologies, increased heights and larger turbines, and turbines better designed for low wind speeds. So offshore wind is not a total game changer from an economic perspective. It's what it does really is add two things. One is it's often a different profile of variability than at least further inland sites. So it often is correlated with the coastal wind that we might install right along the coast, but it is very different from inland wind sites. And so sometimes they're complementary in that way. And that means the combined, variability of all of the wind, both inland and offshore, it might be smoother, and that increases its value. And the second is that it may help regions that have difficulty siting onshore wind resources. So, New England or New Jersey, where I've spent much of my time, it's obviously very difficult to find sites for very large onshore wind facilities. But we could build, many 100-megawatt offshore wind projects. And so even though they're more costly, perhaps they help us avoid some of the siting challenges or the need to extend long distance transmission, into the Midwest states where we have more ample wind capacity.
In terms of talking about various storage technologies other than batteries, you didn't say much about pumped hydro. Do you not see much of a role for it?
Well, I just see limited opportunity to expand pumped hydro relative to the scales of storage needs that we have in these kinds of scenarios. We see many gigawatts of battery storage deployed in a lot of the runs that we do. And, there are certain locations where additional pumped hydro capacity can be added, where you already have an upper reservoir or lower reservoir that you can just, add a new one where that might be cost effective. But in general, pumped hydro is, very limited by siting constraints, and so, where it's cost effective, it can play a role. It generally is not a long duration storage option. There are some pumped hydro facilities that have, several weeks or months of storage, but those tend to be constrained by irrigation needs that also use the same reservoir for seasonal irrigation, and so they're not fully flexible for power sector needs. Most of the pumped hydro is designed for daily cycles. It was designed, most of the plants were originally designed to, level out demand for nuclear power plants or coal plants. So, they charge overnight and discharge during the day. And so in that sense, they're another fast burst or kind of intraday storage option that competes with lithium ion batteries or demand flexibility.
Thanks. And you showed us analysis for New England ISO. Would the analysis have been different in any significant way if you had looked at a different part of the country?
Yeah, not qualitatively. I mean, quantitatively, yeah. Obviously, the pace at which the value decline goes down, or it changes in every region based on the temporal profiles of the technologies, or the wind and solar and demand in each region. But qualitatively, it's the same finding we see in study after study in region after region.
Okay. Now, this is a bigger picture question. If folks assume that, hey, you're right, we need to do more with these firm resources in terms of getting to 100%, but we don't need to do all that much with them to get to 50 or 60 or even 70%. And a lot of these technologies are still in the development phase. Is there an argument to be made? Well, let's just acknowledge that we're going to need these firm resources, keep working on them with beta projects and lab research, but let's kick the can down the road and come back to it in 10 years.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an argument I hear a lot. It depends on your state context and, what role you think your state has in advancing emerging technologies. A lot of states have played a key leadership role in advancing the maturity of, wind and solar and now lithium ion batteries with, things like state level mandates and tax credits for those technologies when they were in their less mature and more costly phases. And what we learned from those technologies is that, lab research is helpful and it's critical to fund well, and, state and federal agencies need to be investing in continued R&D for low carbon technologies. It's not just a question, driving down the cost is not just about lab research. It's also about deployment and improvement of these technologies in the field, and the experience and learning curves that are unlocked when you drive steady and successive deployment of these technologies. And so just as states across the Northeast, across the Eastern Seaboard now are setting early procurement requirements for offshore wind in the hopes that those will drive a new industry that will dramatically reduce the cost of offshore wind, for example, we could be doing the same thing for firm low carbon technologies today that are costly on a per megawatt hour basis, but we don't need to deploy a lot of them to start that early cost declines, because they're those experience curves accrue quickly when a technology is relatively immature. So I think each state and each region has to think about their regional context and which mix of these technologies might make the most sense in the long term. But just as states have played a leadership role in supporting wind in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s when it was much more costly than alternatives, or solar in the 2000s when states like New Jersey and California and others had aggressive support for solar that played a key role in driving down its cost, or that states across the country are playing for offshore wind and battery storage today, I think that they can play a similar role and should play a similar role for firm low carbon resources if you want those technologies available in a decade's time to cost effectively scale up and meet our 100% clean energy goals in the kind of 2040 to 2050 timeframe that most states are setting them. It took us 20 years to make solar and wind cheap, and much of that occurred in the last decade of sustained policy support for deployment. And so if we want to make these firm low carbon options cheap and scalable over the next decade, we really have to get started today.
Good, thank you. And how about the issue, did you explore the potential for more dramatic changes in load shifting and changes in energy use patterns so that, that it addresses not just really short hour by hour variations, but more longer term variations in energy consumption?
Yep. So we have, there's sort of three things to think about. One is the impact of electrification on, of heating or transportation or industry on demand profile. So I showed that it increased by 150% the total electricity demand in our study at the beginning of the presentation. But not only does it increase the total consumption, it dramatically changes the profile. So particularly in regions that where we electrify heating, it can shift the peak in electricity demand from a summer peaking system that peaks in the late afternoon when it's hot to a winter peaking system that peaks overnight on a cold winter night. And that winter peak can be quite a bit higher than the current summer peak if we push electrification of heating, to a substantial degree, particularly in the kind of northern half of the country. And so there's a huge change in the profile that we need to account for, and we do that in a lot of our modeling. We think about what impacts, future degrees of electrification will have, and that changes the relative, value of technology significantly, right? So fairly obvious that if you're shifting from a summer peaking afternoon system to a winter peaking nighttime system, that might shift the relative value of solar and wind, right? Where wind now is more valuable in that context. And it also generally increases the need for firm low carbon options because the seasonality of electricity demand starts to increase as it electrifies heating. We have a similar seasonal trend in electric vehicle charging as well, because we run heaters in the winter in our cars off of the batteries, and so they charge more frequently and use more energy in the winter months as well. So that's the first piece, and it definitely changes the value. It's something that all states should be thinking about, not just their electricity sector goals, but how those fit into the broader economy-wide goals, and how a greater penetration of EVs or electric heating can change that. The second is a lot of those loads are more flexible, particularly on shorter time frames. So EV charging is a great example where I need enough battery charge in the morning to go to work, but I don't necessarily need to charge it the minute I get home from work. And so I have 12 hours when that car is plugged in at night, and another 8 hours when it's plugged in at the office. And if we charge the vehicle in a coordinated way, that could be a very flexible source of demand. And that could substantially reduce the need for energy storage. It's essentially another fast burst technology. And in our study, we looked at a case where we assumed 20% of all demand was shiftable by 8 hours for free in the optimization, just to sort of see what would happen. And what it did was it basically displaced the need for batteries one for one. So the more flexible demand we unlock, the less we need to deploy more costly battery storage. The longer term, the third piece is the question that you asked about longer term, beyond the kind of intradaily changes in demand. And that one I'm a little bit more skeptical about. I've had a hard time thinking of examples of how we are going to shift much of the current existing electricity consumption by weeks or months or seasons, right? You can delay charging your car for even a day or two because your commute is often shorter than the total, battery charge for a 200-mile, 250-mile EV. But you're not going to delay it for a season. You're not going to wait to charge your car until spring. And there are a lot of other things like that where, you can shift your heating consumption by a few hours, but you're not even going to shift it by a day. So what that leaves is a category of possible new demand sources that are designed from the beginning to be flexible and to basically run whenever cheap wind and solar are available and to turn off otherwise. And there are a few categories there that might work, and I think of these sort of as demand sinks. They're places that you can kind of dump the wind and solar into when you have enough of it. One example is hydrogen electrolysis. So if we have cheap enough electrolyzers, and they definitely need to see costs continue to fall for this to pencil out, then it's okay to run them intermittently, where we only run them maybe 40% of the time when the wind or solar is available, and we crank out a valuable fuel and we let them idle the rest of the time. Another example would be installing resistive heaters for boilers alongside natural gas boilers and industrial process heat, where you effectively have a dual fuel option so that when cheap electricity is available, you run the resistive heater for process heat, and when the wind and sun die down, you use natural gas from your gas boiler. And that allows wind and solar to effectively, in both cases, preserve their fuel saving value, so that instead of it falling to zero, as it did in the cases I showed without this sort of demand sink, it falls to whatever the value of the fuel in the other sector it's displacing is. So whatever the value of the hydrogen is that displaces natural gas or oil, and or the value of the natural gas displaced by the electric resistive heater or boiler. And so those may be important options in the longer term when we have very high shares of wind and solar. If you think about 60, 70% combined wind and solar share, there's going to be a lot of the year when you have enough wind and solar at low cost to fuel those activities, and that could help sort of flatten out the valleys in consumption. But it's not going to solve the peaks challenge, which is that you still need enough firm power to get through those cold winter nights when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And so it helps make wind and solar play a larger role in the overall economy, but it doesn't displace the need for firm low carbon generation.
Hey, that seems like a good point to end. Thanks very much for a very illuminating presentation, and thanks to everybody who stayed and listened to this webinar and stayed extra time. We really hope you'll be back for future webinars of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. Go to Jesse's website to find out about some of his other publications you may want to read. And thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.